Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into this video. I'm Smitty from SmittyStudio, and today I'm going to be talking about how I went about creating one of my new pieces called a discovery. In many ways, I am inspired by an artist that I've read and learned about in my schooling, and his name is Hubert Robert. He was a French artist who particularly worked during the 1700s. And in many ways, his art focuses on architecture and depicts it at this grand and sort of metaphorical scale. I think in many ways I am inspired by how he encapsulates the sort of emotion of the architecture and how he depicts it at this grand scale. Usually there are people that are sprinkled throughout the scene and who are either interacting with the architecture, who are inspired by it, in awe of the architecture, or who are just sort of carrying out everyday tasks in their contemporary behavior. In many ways, I wanted to sort of take this inspiration and approach the scene, my version of a scene, with a sort of modern standpoint of using a 3D software and then hand painting the textures using my iPad. So as you can see now, I am playing through the steps that I took to sort of hand paint the texture of the scene. This was not the first step, however. And I should also say, by no means was I really ever trained in hand painting or in painting in general. I do know some of the basics of depicting light and shadow, and these were things that I wanted to focus on in doing the hand-painted textures. But there are probably some steps that I either avoided just because I didn't know better, or some things that I should have done which I didn't. This is all sort of the learning curve for me and doing this sort of drawing of the texture. But the first step of this all was to create a 3D scene as such. And so here I am in Blender, which is a free software that you should all check out if you have the time. And so what I'm showing here is this sort of 3D modeled space. And I have specific components, some with more detail than others. But I modeled the scene as I needed to in order to get this perspective here. So this is roughly the perspectives that I had when I was getting the idea of how I wanted to hand paint the textures. Once I had 3D modeled this space, I then exported the perspective into a program on my iPad, which I then used to hand paint the textures as you saw. So while we're here in the 3D space, I'll sort of give you an idea of how I've set this up. You know, I had a rough idea of what perspective I needed and where the viewer would be looking at the painting of the scene. And so I basically set up a camera first, and then I sort of started to model the scene back into the space, setting up different components and thinking about the hierarchy that I wanted to define. If we sort of zoom out here, you can see how the scene is sort of encapsulated in this box to control the lighting of the scene. And then we have these background elements, which are sort of off in the distance. We also have the ability, because this is a 3D scene, to play around with lighting, and this comes into a very useful hand when we start to apply the textures. So for example, let's say I grab this component. If we go over to UV editing, here you can see the hand painted textures. Here you see the component that I selected. I can reproject the texture back onto the scene or the components of the scene. And then I can do some fine tuning to make sure that the textures are sort of lining up the way that I need them to. If we go back over here to layout, I will turn us over to the viewport shading. Here you can see what the scene looks like without anything, any sort of lighting or shading. And then if we move it over to here, we get an idea of what the scene looks like when we are putting in the lighting. And so if I grab this light, for example, I can move it around and you can start to see the power of using this method. We can start to mess around with shadows. We can even mess around with the brightness of the light or the color of the light. And these are all incredibly powerful things that are offered to us by using this method of projecting a hand-painted texture onto a 3D model. And there's other things that we can do as well. So for example, these rocks, which are scattered, this sort of rock or rubble which is scattered across the ground, is an object that I simply created in Blender and then redistributed along a plane. And these were not hand painted, but what I did was I took a texture from the overall texture, applied it to these, and it worked just as good as I needed it to. The same can be said for these bricks or the other rocks which are scattered in the scene. So if I take a few steps back here, I'll get the people back, and the people were a little bit of a little difficult for me because I'm not super well trained in drawing people. This is something that I will certainly be working on going forward. But what I would say is another sort of challenge here is that I painted them as a 2D image. Still, as you can see right now, they are only 2D. I think if there was a really clean and efficient way to sort of map them onto a 3D character, that would help in the shadows. This is nothing that I cannot fix in just doing some simple Photoshop work, but it is something to be considered, something to be said. But overall, I think there's something to be said about this process. I really enjoyed hand painting the textures, and I really enjoyed that process. There are a lot of benefits to this, and some things are tricky, as can be said about any sort of process. But I think there's a lot of fun here. I think it's really relaxing to go through this process, and when you reproject the textures onto the model, it's sort of like putting together a puzzle, and getting everything to line up as it comes alive is just so much fun. So anyways, going forward and sort of producing this as an NFT, I would like to create a sort of series of images, probably a collection, I guess you could call it. And what I want to do is I want to export, I want to create images that are, of course, the scene itself. But I do want to do other images that celebrate the process that was had here. I want to demonstrate that this is not just something that was completely hand painted. This is in fact a 3D thing which has components that can be moved and has components which are sort of dynamic. I want to show that in some way. So I think that there are creative ways that I can either show the sort of construction of the 3D model, of the 3D space, the sort of grid that was followed here, and the way that the lighting is used. I think that these are fun things, and I'd like to celebrate the creation, the process of this image. So keep an eye out over the next few days, possibly week or so, as I will finish this image and the story that I want to tell. Anyways, thank you guys very much for watching this video. I hope that it was somewhat inspiring. This was not within my total comfort zone. I am comfortable with Blender, but not with hand painting, and this was the first sort of image that I've ever done where I hand painted textures. So it was a fun challenge, and I hope that you guys appreciate it in that way. Anyways, thank you guys for watching the video. I hope that you're having a great day, and thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you next time.